Hi, my name is Mia Bays and I run Bird's Eye View, and we are a 17-year young mission bringing ever greater audiences to films by women, specifically celebrating the female creative perspective. So films that are directed by women, written by women, based on a book or a story or a life story of a woman. And this event tonight celebrates Shirley, directed by Josephine Decker and adapted by Sarah Gubbins, who's a Chicago-based playwright and screenwriter, and it's based on a book by Susan Scarf Merrill, Shirley, a novel. And we have a special panel who you can see gathered around me, and we are going to be talking about the themes and the creative process of both the film and also of Shirley Jackson, the subject herself. And I want to just recognize that obviously we are all, if you're watching this in the UK, going into another lockdown. Some of us are in it already. The world feels, I think it's understatement to say the world feels a little bit odd and crazy right now. It feels sort of appropriate to enter the world of Shirley, and it feels like a relief and a balm. So we will be unpacking this very, very powerful and strange world that both the film creates, but also Shirley Jackson, the novelist, creates. And boy, does it feel like a relief to be doing this and not thinking about what's going on in the world right now. So I would like to welcome our special panel. They each have a connection to the themes of the topic or both. And so we're each going to be responding to the film, and then we'll have a conversation. And then please, at any point, if you've seen the film, please put comments or questions at any point during our conversation, and we'll get to them when we can. So I would like to ask everyone to introduce themselves. Let's start with you, Joan. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mia. Hello, I am Dr. Joan Passi. I'm a teacher at the University of Bristol, and my research focuses on Gothic fiction, horror fiction from the 18th century through to the present day, with a particular interest in the wonderful world of Shirley Jackson.
And Tara, can I turn to you? So it's wonderful to have you here. You're one of our cinema partners and one of several. And yeah, it'd be lovely to hear from you.
Thank you, Mia. Hi, everyone. I'm Tara. I am cinema producer at Watershed in Bristol, so independent cinema here, and a freelance film critic as well, and a big fan of Josephine Decker's work, and yeah, really loved Shirley, so lots of great themes to explore.
Wonderful. And Hayley Louise, welcome.
Hi, Mia. Thanks for having me. My name is Hayley Louise Charlesworth. I'm a PhD researcher at Manchester Metropolitan University. My research focuses on depictions of bisexuality, biphobia and bi-erasure in the contemporary Gothic, particularly in film and television.
You are in the right place, Hayley. And Hannah, last but not least, welcome.
Hi, I'm Hannah Woodhead. I am the associate editor at Little White Lies magazine. We're a independent film magazine for anyone who doesn't know. And we have just done a big issue all about Shirley, kind of exploring everything we love about film. So yeah, I'm very happy to be here repping for the film that I love so much.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so everyone's going to respond from their perspective to the film one by one. So, Dr. Joan, let's start with you as you're the resident Shirley Jackson expert.
Thank you, Mia. Dr. Joan, it never gets old.
Right.
I'm loath to think of myself as an expert just because she wrote so much. I think maybe I'm a bit more of a fangirl, a very passionate fangirl. She wrote over the course of her career in 20th century. So she was born in 1916 and died quite young in 1965. And she wrote 6 novels, 2 memoirs, and over 200 short stories. She was popular at the time. She was prolific. Her work was widely read, widely circulated. She was a career writer. So she was writing for money. It was her job. She was married to an academic, an English literature academic called Stanley Hyman, who also appears in the film. And she did spend a lot of her life living in academic spaces, living with universities, interacting with students, engaging in Hyman's work, which was largely about folklore. And you can see that coming through in her own work a lot. Quite a lot of it is about myth and legend and the construction of narrative. She sort of never really made it over to the UK as such, even though I'm obsessed with her. It's not a name people are immediately necessarily familiar with in the UK, and yet her impact on horror and the Gothic is almost impossible to estimate. She's had a little bit of a resurgence lately. We've had a bit of a Shirley Jackson renaissance in the last kind of 5-6 years with the Netflix adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House, a loose adaptation, but brought Shirley back to attention. There's a character in it called Shirley, I think, in honour of her. And in the same year, there was the Stacey Passon adaptation of We Have Always Lived in the Castle. There was also a 1963 and a 1999 Haunting of Hill House adaptation of varying degrees of cheesiness. And she's also seeped into popular culture in other ways. So the new Netflix TV show, The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, not only has an episode based on Jackson's short story, The Lottery, but also has a character called Shirley Jackson, who is fittingly killed off, sorry, spoilers, fittingly killed off with a poisoned cupcake. And so much of Jackson's work is about this idea of weaponizing femininity, of finding the fangs and the harsh edges and the strangeness in stereotypical, archetypal depictions of idealized feminine domestic spaces. And arguably, we wouldn't have characters like Sabrina the Teenage Witch without without her body of work on the strange teenage girl, the kind of witchy, spooky, odd idea of the all-American teenager being assert. Carrie, for example, takes a lot of inspiration from Shirley Jackson's work. Stephen King has cited her as a major influence. Neil Gaiman has cited her as an influence. Joyce Carol Oates, Victor Lavelle, Joanne Harris all say that their work is inspired by her. And the Shirley Jackson Awards, held every year, are a celebration of some of the greatest horror and Gothic stories released in the contemporary market. So her name is still a marker of brilliance, of excellence, of the Gothic. The film that came out, I think it was last year, Midsummer, draws a lot from The Lottery, which I love that it's the short story read at the beginning of the film, because that is a lot of people's entrance into Shirley Jackson, so it's very fitting. And if you saw Midsummer, you can see it's also taking a lot from The Wicker Man, which is inspired by The Lottery, which in America is considered one of the greatest short stories in the American canon. A lot of her writing, people have disputed whether she can necessarily be called Gothic or not, because her work isn't so much explicitly about ghosts and ghouls and goblins. It's more about the internal, about the psychological, the fragmented psyche, how we process trauma, and how that can manifest in frightening and haunting ways, this idea of kind of self-haunting. And she's not really interested in the Gothic as something unreal or fantastical, but as a way of articulating how strange our experience of reality is, how the oddness and the weirdness of our everyday experience, and especially of being a woman in a world that is not necessarily kind to women, which is a big part of the film as well. The world is so cruel to girls. She's really working on usurping the ideal of post-war domestic Americana. So on a day when maybe we don't really want to be thinking about American national identity as such, it's hard to escape when we're thinking about Jackson. So she's taking this image of the housewife in the poofy skirt with dinner on the table for the husband and really rendering it raw and frightening and fragmented. And this arguably inspired stuff like the Stepford Wives and the Bell Jar. We wouldn't have had Sylvia Plath's Bell Jar without Shirley Jackson's discussion of kind of the horrors of campus life for young women in the 50s and 60s. And she was inspired by lots of different sources. The central text in the film is Hangs a Man. That's the one that she's writing throughout. That is a novel published by Shirley Jackson, if you want to go and find it for yourself. Interestingly, the lines from Hangs a Man in the film aren't from the book. So there's that other layers of kind of this fantastical construction that's really interesting, because I think Shirley isn't a biopic. I think Decker herself said this is a Shirley Jackson story with Shirley Jackson in it. And so many of Jackson's stories are about her life and her experiences, but kind of refracted through a strange and disturbing lens. And you can see that kind of fantastical interpretation of her life there. But the story of Paula Jean Weldon going missing is a real thing that happened. She has a Wikipedia page. And when the novel was first published, the publishers claimed that it was inspired by that story. But later, Jackson's biographer, Ruth Franklin, found no evidence that it was. So it's even more layers of myth and legend and interpretation that very much fit into this idea of the folklore of Shirley Jackson that the film Shirley is now a part of.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joan. Hannah, let's turn to you next. You actually interviewed Josephine, I believe. So do you want to let us know what that was like?
I mean, that I interviewed her for her last film, which was Madeline's Madeline, and she's just the most kind of wonderful force of nature to be in a room with. She is so kind of full of ideas, and constantly her mind is working a million miles a minute. And I think that comes across definitely in her films. You know, they feel very exuberant and very kind of creative and exciting. And when I spoke to her last summer, we were talking about Shirley, because she just finished filming it, and she was kind of expressing a little kind of doubt, I guess, over what was a big step up from her. She's gone from working very much in the independent cinema, the very experimental origin she came from, to making this quite glossy and starry film. You know, it stars Elisabeth Moss and Michael Stuhlbarg, who are two big names in the acting world. A lot of people will know Elisabeth Moss from The Handmaid's Tale, which was her kind of big, like, everyone, the show on everyone's lips. And then, of course, Michael Stuhlbarg had a great year in 2017 with his supporting role in Call Me By Your Name. So I think for Josephine Decker, this was a real sort of a different approach to filmmaking. It was a lot more kind of a lot more budget. Was one of the things she said was unusual about this project. She's usually making things on a shoestring, whereas with the studio involvement on Shirley, there was a lot more resources and a lot more people. But having said that, I think it is still very much within her kind of interests as a director. She always makes these really sort of these films that grapple with creativity and what it means to be a female artist. And for me, I think the most kind of fascinating thing, or one of the most fascinating things I should say, about her is how she manages to weave together all these disparate things. So, you know, we've got the side of Shirley, which is about being a writer, and then the side that's about being a female writer within that, and then the kind of queerness, which is so important to the story. And I'll let Hayley talk about that more than I will. But I was really kind of intrigued when she mentioned that this was the project she was doing. And I spoke to Elisabeth Moss about it as well earlier this year after the film had come out. And speaking to her was so interesting, because she's kind of made a career out of playing difficult women, I would say, really kind of the roles that I think a lot of people wouldn't expect her to take. You think of things like Jane Campion's Top of the Lake, which was another huge success, and Alex Ross Perry's Her Smell, which came out last year. She's very good at playing these women who are quite abrasive, but at the same time completely compelling. And I think in Shirley, you're repelled by her, but you also totally feel for her, and you definitely want to kind of see more of her. And part of that, of course, comes from the wonderful script by Sarah Gubbins. I think it's a team effort on behalf of Josephine and Sarah and the wonderful cast. But another thing that I was so taken aback by is that when we think of a biopic, we kind of think of the stuffy awards bait kind of Darkest Hour or Theory of Everything type films. So I can totally understand why Josephine was a bit reluctant to use that term, because that's not what this is. It's very much kind of if Shirley Jackson was telling Shirley Jackson's story. I think it's, there's lots of details from her life which are omitted. I think one of the most fascinating choices to me was that they decided to omit the fact that Shirley actually had a family. She was raising young children at the time of writing all these novels, which is an incredible feat to be able to do all that, let alone do all that in the 50s. But this was omitted from the script to kind of, I guess, make it feel a little bit more fluid and not kind of have that second, like, she is very abrasive to kind of Rose and to all the other wives at the school, but when she goes home, she's a doting parent. I think it just makes it a lot cleaner. But then, I I guess I'll hand over to Tara to talk about it. I don't want to talk about all the kind of wonderful elements of this film.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, over to you, Tara.
Thank you. Yeah, wonderful points raised already. So I'm just going to jump in with my focus on the film, which is only one of very many elements that are in there. So this is it by no means a definitive reading, but it's the thing that really drew me in the most, which is much like Hannah, I've been watching Josephine's films, and there's such a through line, I think, between them in her artistic style, but also her kind of approach to a kind of moral project. And really early on, I was struck with her first film, Butter on the Latch, and the Independent Cinema Office did a tour of the two films together, that and Thou Wast Smile and Lovely, when it came out. So they did the two films together. And I remember thinking that, these films are so disparate in terms of genre and tone in some ways, and yet they both seem to have this really dark, sinister, simmering undertone of something not quite right. And duplicity was always somewhere hidden in that for me. And one of the things that Josephine said when she did a Q&A at Watershed for the film was that she really heavily was into Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way. And Julia Cameron is really heavily into Jung. And then in Madeline's Madeline, there's a direct quote from Jung. And so this sort of, led me to this, okay, there's something going on here with The Artist's Way, with Jung, and this sort of way in which these two things intersect. And I think one of the things that Madeline's Madeline also brings up is about the creative process and what that process is like, those kind of dangerous lines between where does what is your project become everyone's project? What is too close and too much artistic liberty? When does it become at the cost of the personal? There are all these kind of questions around creativity. And actually, if you go back to Butter on the Latch, they're there from the very start, especially the very, very start of Butter on the Latch is actually a performance piece that we're watching on a stage. And it's literally two people saying two become one. And so there's this whole thing about the Jungian shadow artist for me that kind of really comes up in her work, which I made the short video essay about. And it's more of a provocation and a question about her work than it is trying to define anything specific. But I think that there's definitely this concept that her characters need to face up to and acknowledge the kind of other parts of themselves, the parts of themselves that they either are afraid of or are pretending that they don't know about and that don't exist. And there's lots of really interesting things in her work about, who is real and who is kind of haunting whom, and those sorts of things really come out for me in Shirley. And I thought it was fascinating because it's the first piece that obviously Decker has not written herself, that it's somebody else's work adapted for the screen by someone else, and yet it still very much for me has this mark that is a through line through her entire oeuvre. And I think that some of that is done visually, so it's thematic certainly, but also even visually I think there are things like the way in which the camera work is closely following certain characters when they're having certain kind of crises of themselves, or when they're not sure about certain elements of who they are, or they're kind of searching within their identity, and also within the sort of art direction and the beautiful busyness that a lot of the scenes have. I mean, there's just gorgeous wallpaper in Shirley that somebody could just endlessly write about, and it relates to this idea in Madeline's Madeline, where there's this line of dialogue about Jung, and this idea that even chaos for Jung had this sense of cosmos. So there was order within the disorder. And I think we really get that with her characters, that there is some sort of internal logic, even within their spiraling out of control. And so there's this really kind of fascinating thing at play about creative process, about the questions of facing up to and accepting yourself. And one of the things that Julia Cameron's Artist's Way is really concerned with is this idea that you really have to break free of your shadow artist, but you also have to kind of confront all of the shadows and all of the hauntings in your previous life in order to unleash and kind of access and repair your creativity. And actually for Julia Cameron, creativity is divinity as well. So there's this real sense of sort of yearning for this actual kind of almost epiphany, which I think is really fascinating when you look at the way in which her characters have these narrative arcs that they have to go on, which are almost like sometimes a sort of recovery process or a sort of search for the self, and whether they do that through another character and to whom, you know, whose benefit and to whose fatality that might be. And yeah, deliciously explored, I think, in Shirley.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tara. And Hayley, your response to the film, please.
Well, first of all, Joan said that most people's introduction to Shirley Jackson is usually The Lottery. Mine was actually Hangsaman. It was the first work of hers that I read, which was quite exciting when I discovered that this film was delving into that in a lot of detail. As everyone said, I don't think this is supposed to be viewed as an accurate biopic of Shirley Jackson, nor is it intending to be. And I think that is kind of applied to the depiction of sexuality in the film as well. I know that some of Shirley Jackson's biographers have speculated on her sexuality, but I don't think that this question of is Shirley Jackson bisexual is what is being explored in this film. I think it all comes down to how you view the character of Rose and her significance and her meaning within the narrative. I feel like, as Tara said, there was this question of kind of what's real in this film. I feel like Rose, rather than a character in her own right, and obviously she is a fictional character, she serves more as like a series of projections for Shirley. So she could function as a representation of Shirley herself as a young, ambitious, talented, intelligent woman who is being stifled by patriarchal oppression. I know I've spoken with Joan about this previously, so maybe Joan wants to come in with something about that afterwards. But as Shirley is researching and writing Hangsaman, Rose starts to stand in for Shirley's kind of obsession with who Paula is, why she disappeared, and that's obviously aided by having Odessa Young play both Paula and Rose in the film. And then I think the sexual relationship is an extension of that in a way. It's more of Shirley's infatuation with the mystery surrounding Paula rather than an explicit attraction to Rose herself. It is a very brief, in terms of the overall kind of run of the film, the kind of sexual relationship only makes up a couple of minutes. I've seen some commentators, after I watched the film, I looked to see what other people were saying about it. I've seen some people saying that Shirley, along with Stanley, are intending to break the couple, Fred and Rose, which I definitely think is the case in Stanley's case. He wants Fred out of there, and then the final scene is them celebrating that. But I don't really agree with that take so much, because that kind of casts Shirley Jackson as this manipulative bisexual stereotype, which is not uncommon in the media. It's what my whole thesis is about, but that feels a little uncomfortable to me in terms of what I'm aware of with who Shirley Jackson is and what her kind of storytelling is. I find it a lot more interesting to read that sexual relationship as a genuine infatuation on Shirley's part, but the infatuation is with Paula and consequently with Natalie in Hangsaman than with Rose herself. And there's this whole kind of tradition in, well, I'm not sure if tradition is the right word, but there's this trope in the queer Gothic of using the double, and the double generally displays a more uninhibited sexuality that is sometimes read as monstrous. I don't read kind of Rose or Paula in this film as monstrous, but that is a tradition within the queer Gothic, and I feel that having Odessa Young play both characters is a really interesting choice, in that you kind of see Rose become Paula at the end, but also from my limited memories of Hangsaman, because it's a while since I read it, a few years now, that also doesn't kind of marry up with the character of Natalie in the book from what I remember, but the book also has this doubling between Natalie and the character of Tony, who is a character who is kind of influencing Natalie in the same way that I suppose the mystery surrounding Paula and Shirley herself are influencing Rose. So I think there are a lot of really interesting questions to ask about how this film is depicting sexuality. I don't think any of them are very straightforward, and that's the thing that I found the most interesting about this film, because I feel that Shirley Jackson herself, in what I've read of her work, is very similar, that there are no kind of black and white answers to how female sexuality is represented in her work and consequently in this film.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hayley. Lots of nodding from you, Joan. What would you like to pick up on? I mean, I think particularly the point when we had our previous discussion was about the exploration of a woman's relationship to sides of herself and what Rose may represent within that.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of Jackson's work is about this fractured, fragmented self, different aspects of self, which very much ties into what Tara was saying about Jung, and also about Jackson's interactions with Sigmund Freud as well. This idea that self can be multivalent, and is not something kind of simplistic or reductive. And the film deals with that by having Shirley Jackson as a fictionalization, aspects of Shirley Jackson's biography from her real life, aspects of Shirley Jackson, how she represented herself and her marriage in her own stories. And then you have Paula, you have the character within Hangs a Man called Paula, when in the novel she's called Natalie. Then you have the same actress playing both Paula and Rose. And then you have Rose, who could be, as Hayley was saying, an avatar for different aspects of Shirley's psyche, of her persona, which very much ties into the novel. I don't want to spoil it, but Hangs a Man, a novel, is basically a better, earlier Fight Club in terms of its engagement with these kind of manifestations of the self and how they can be used to process trauma. And I always wondered when I watched the film, the extent to which Rose is a stand-in, as Hayley said, a stand-in for Jackson herself, being a young woman with frustrated ambitions who's being humiliated by her academic husband, which is very much part of Shirley's own life story. And to what extent Rose could be representing this process of creation. You know, she's pregnant throughout the narrative, and once she gives birth, that's also when Shirley finishes the novel. And that's a recurrent trope in Gothic fiction, kind of the strangeness and monstrosity of process of creation, Frankenstein's monster, and that's often aligned with birth. And Jackson writes about the idea of her process of writing parallel to her experiences as a mother. And she problematizes motherhood. She takes the shiny gloss off of it in her writing and makes it something uncanny and a bit disturbing and raw and frightening. And that's a big part of her wider work. And if we're thinking of Rose in terms of aspects of Shirley and also in terms of this process of writing, I wonder if she almost becomes Shirley's wife in this film, in as much as, you know, Virginia Woolf talking about a room of one's own, how a woman needs space to write. When Rose comes into Shirley's life, she takes on the domestic responsibilities. She's preparing for the food. She's handling the husband. She's handling Shirley's social obligations, which gives Shirley space to write. And she almost becomes that behind every great man is a great woman, that stereotype. Rose becomes Shirley's great woman. And again, Hyman says Rose can leave once the novel's finished. So I think there are multiple parts of Shirley as woman, as writer, as creator, that Rose kind of, her history, that Rose kind of comes to be an avatar for or to represent.
Fantastic, thank you. And Hannah and then Tara, if I can turn to you to just pick up or add on, respond to anything that anyone else has said, or just expand on your original thought.
Yeah, I think that as well as Rose kind of representing these different aspects of Shirley's personality, or Shirley's kind of life, that Shirley herself comes to represent so many different things to Rose. I mean, when we first meet them, they are adversaries, shall we say. I think Rose very much looks up to Shirley and is very excited about the prospect of meeting her. And then when she does, there's a kind of she's quite upset to discover that Shirley doesn't like her very much, or at least that's her perception. And it's quite funny to watch how sort of cutting Shirley is with her, and how Shirley has sort of no time for this young woman that comes into her house. But as the film progresses, their relationship obviously develops, and they go from being adversaries to confidants to this almost maternal relationship. Once Rose has her baby, Shirley really takes on the kind of more nurturing role that Rose had before. There's kind of a reversal going on that we see throughout the film. And I think looking at Josephine's earlier films, she's always kind of been fascinated by the idea of performance and acting. I mean, Madeline is a whole film about acting and performance. And I think this is a kind of continuation of those interests for her. She's really interested in how we perform in every single day of our lives, and the kind of the way we change how we are around different people. There's a wonderful scene in the film where Shirley goes to a party on campus that her husband's faculty are throwing, and the way she is around the kind of faculty wives is so different from how she is around Rose or around Stanley. She very much plays into this mythology around her, that she's some kind of witch who wants to hex all these women, and she really seems to relish the idea of her as this unlikable harridan who really is kind of chaining Stanley to her. And it's kind of nice to see a woman reveling in such kind of misery, whereas usually I think when we watch films about being a female writer in particular, or a female artist, it's very much emphasizing how difficult it is. And I think that does come across in Shirley, but it's not kind of so totally dependent on the idea that she had to struggle. There's a lot of kind of glee in it as well, which I really enjoyed. As someone who is currently writing a book, it felt like the most honest kind of depiction of how frustrating it is that I've seen in quite a while. And there's some wonderful one-liners that Shirley has about writing. There's a wonderful moment when Rose says to her, "Oh, how's the writing going?" And she just gives her this like total look of malice and says, "Never ask me that again," which is, you know, the most kind of relatable thing to hear as a writer.
Wonderful, thank you, Hannah. And Tara?
Yeah, absolutely agree with everything that both Joan and Hannah have said, and everything Hayley was saying as well. I think that this film is really rich in that way, and Decker's work absolutely is. There's also definitely this idea of the kind of creative process as in terms of what I was saying about it being unlocked, is that it's almost this automatic or improvised or instinctual thing that you have to get to by getting through those layers of the ego and the persona. So in that kind of sense of what the shadow is, or where that unconscious is kind of unlocking that potential. And I think to do with Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way is that, you know, the fundamental thing about that creative process that she kind of heralds is morning pages, which is this idea of getting up in the morning and the first thing you do every day is automatic writing. And it doesn't matter what it is, you just write 3 pages every single day. And that's the first part of the recovery of the creative process. And we see a lot with Shirley, with her sort of like the differences between when she is just writing and when she's unable to write something, and this idea of the block being something that has to be unlocked by kind of accessing all parts of yourself and facing up to the bits you don't want to face up to. And that's at the point in which Rose, you know, enters the narrative, and this idea of her being a sort of a double, or the elements of the shadow that potentially she doesn't want to face. And I think that's fascinating, given the idea that, you know, if Shirley is in fact somebody who in the real world would be raising children and maybe having some of those housewifery elements to herself, those are the things that the writerly Shirley doesn't want to face. Those are two separate, they've been separated out in the narrative here into 2 separate characters, but potentially in Shirley's psyche they are kind of separate elements of herself, and she's given one a persona and one an ego, or put one in the shadow. There's also this idea in Jung about the anima and the animus, which is to do with the masculine and feminine qualities, and they're the kind of masculine qualities in the female and the feminine qualities in the male. And that's a little bit of an outdated kind of concept today, but I think there is something or some element of that, in the sense that the young couple who arrive are kind of the anima and the animus to the couple whose home they have come into. Rose has got the kind of feminine attributes, and Shirley has the more masculine attributes, or what we might attribute to masculine attributes. I should be careful to say, not necessarily my prescription, but in terms of a society of what the social codes are. So we might kind of understand those characters then in a way of kind of seeing in each other, or Shirley and her husband seeing in this young couple the other elements of themselves, or the parts of themselves that they won't acknowledge or don't allow to exist within themselves. And that's why you get this such fascinating kind of cat and mousery, because yes, it is a couple taunting another couple, but it is also the couple facing the demons that they have, their interior issues, and all of their deepest, darkest things that they don't like about themselves. And I think that's why it feels so delicious. It's got this kind of this sense of characters playing it out, but it feels in that way like the creative process playing out these sorts of various parts of interiority.
Wonderful. And Hayley, anything to add, or anything in response to what anyone else has said?
Just briefly on what Tara's just said there about kind of Shirley and Stanley facing the parts of themselves that they don't want to face through this other couple. At the end, the time where they're actually happy in each other's company, things are going well for them, is after they have faced these doubles of themselves and got rid of them. And they've kind of broken this couple kind of irreparably now. Like, you get the sense that their marriage isn't going to survive, and it's kind of like the crumbling of the Jacksons' marriage has been displaced onto this other couple, and they can now move forward. I don't want to romanticize it, because it's not a very healthy relationship between the Jacksons as depicted in this film, but it does kind of feel like at the end the Jacksons feel like they are in a good place, because this other couple have taken on all of the trauma, all of the negativity of their relationship.
Wonderful, thank you. I just wanted, before we actually turn this, we've got some great questions coming in, so and they're quite big, chunky questions to get our teeth around. I wanted to just pick up on the point about the really quite radical decisions that, I love, again, that quote from Josephine Decker, the director: "We were more focused on putting the audience in a Shirley Jackson type story than replicating Shirley's life." And actually, I've read quite a lot of responses from people who were probably Shirley Jackson fans, being really quite enraged by the fact that the film plays fast and loose with her biography. But for all the reasons that you've all outlined, I think that's why the film's fabulous, because it's not conventional and there's lots of reasons and thinking behind it. And Joan, I just wanted to pick up, I wanted all of you to just maybe just expand on that a little bit more. But also, Joan, I wonder, do you know Shirley a novel? Because I presume actually structurally that's also what happens in the book on which this screenplay is based.
So the film is as based on the novel as it is based on Shirley's life, as it is based on short stories. It's really almost a collage of these different sources, which fits again very well with Jackson's preoccupation with this kind of myth making and dislocation and fantasy and distance from reality that really comes across. And I suppose you could see the novel and the film as almost a response to Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, in terms of appealing to that longer tradition of the anxiety of the couples, and how that is really motivated and fueled by this academic environment, this really claustrophobic, backbiting, difficult academic environment. I say from my university office. And there is very much a sense here of Scaffell as well as Decker, as well as Jackson, playing with this idea of longer traditions of representations of really difficult women. Because that's something that comes across in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf as well. And that's something that comes across just in referencing Virginia Woolf, that idea of women that do not conform and women that are messy. And I think that really comes across when Rose is rubbing her face in the dirt, which I think I saw somewhere that she improvised that herself, but it's the actress improvised that herself, but it really conjures that sense of this rejection of kind of the shininess and the gloss that is expected of women at this time. This is, 1950s consumerist America. And that idea of just saying, no, I'm going to be messy, I'm going to be sharp, I'm going to be witty, I'm going to be difficult, I'm going to be creative, and you might not like it. And creating something really quite gorgeous out of that.
Does anyone else have anything to add to expand on that before we pick up some of these questions?
I just think that, I think that to do a traditional biopic of Shirley Jackson would be to do a disservice to Shirley Jackson. As Joan said, she's all about kind of myth making and trying to tell stories of femininity that kind of break with the tradition of the time. A biopic, coming from kind of like a more general film studies approach rather than a Gothic approach, I would say that a biopic is one of the most by the numbers, unexperimental styles of film that you could possibly make, and that is just not the right atmosphere or the right feeling for telling the story of Shirley Jackson. So I think that the approach that this film has taken, where it is more of Shirley Jackson as a character in a Shirley Jackson story, is the right approach to take to exploring her life without kind of telling her life story.
Here, yeah, it's my least favourite genre, I must say, the biopic, because usually it's super vanilla, trad, just never very interesting. Tara, Hannah, anything to add on that? Are we pro or con the trad biopic?
Yeah, certainly con. It's interesting because I looked it up last week. How many kind of biopics have been nominated for Oscars, because it is when you think of the Oscars, I think of biopics, it's something like the last time we had a Oscar race without any biopics, you'd have to go back to the 90s, probably the 80s, which is a long time ago now. And even the last few years, it's, if you want to win Oscars, you make a film about someone who existed. It's a surefire win. Whereas I think one of the most kind of valuable things to me about this film is that it really offers filmmakers a way to make a film inspired by a real person without kind of being so didactic. And I think if I was a young film student watching this, thinking about my own filmmaking, I'd be very excited that Decker is here to kind of light the way and really blaze a trail for doing things outside the box and kind of taking a bit of a risk. Because I can totally understand why purists might be a bit kind of affronted by this, but I think personally that Shirley Jackson would have found it all a hoot. I think she would have really enjoyed this interpretation of her life. It's very much in the spirit of her.
Tara, anything to add about the radical play with the genre?
Just to say really that it's about expectation, and I think that I always think it's unwise to expect something to be what you want it to be when it's somebody else's creative project, and that you have to adjust your expectation to accept that not everybody sees things in the same way, of course. So this is not, nobody is saying this is the definitive and only version of events for Shirley Jackson. This is a wonderful creative project that is related to Shirley, and I think that that is where we should sort of consider these things. I'm not a huge fan of biopics, absolutely, for those reasons. I don't particularly like that sort of through line. I much prefer something that is creative and kind of is inspired by somebody else's work or takes elements of it. And I think that the reason this is so exciting is because it's focused, instead of focused on the kind of fact elements of Shirley's life, it's focused on the creative process in her life. Mm-hmm. And that is really a lot more interesting, I think.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so we've got some questions coming in. So first of all, this is probably one mainly for Joan. Do you think the film will lead to a rediscovery of Jackson's work in the UK?
Oh, I really hope so. I think, yeah, there's been a kind of burgeoning interest in her work with the adaptations that have come out, and now with this film. And I think it's going to get a big audience from what I've seen so far, compared to something like Weird Voices in the Castle, which had a really limited release. And Penguin recently have re-released all of her novels and her short story collections, so they're more easily available to a mainstream audience than they've ever been before, and hopefully we'll see a surge of upsells in those. Sort out your Christmas lists. And there is a sense, definitely on social media, that we're currently living in a period with a Shirley Jackson energy, that there's something about the current world we're in and the claustrophobia and the isolation and how fragmentary and disorientating things are, that lends itself to a sort of Shirley Jackson aesthetics, and people might seek solace in these narratives that reflect the strangeness of where we are right now.
Hayley, anything to add to that? Are there any particular stories or work that you'd like to lift up and point people to?
I will be honest, I have not read a great deal of Shirley Jackson stuff. I've read Hangs a Man and a couple of others, but I have noticed, firstly, when Haunting of Hill House came out on Netflix, and then again recently with this film coming out before all of the bookshops had to lock down again, just like huge displays of Shirley Jackson's work, whereas before the Netflix adaptation, you might find one copy of The Haunting of Hill House in the horror section at Waterstones. So I do feel like the resurgence is already here, and it started with that adaptation, but it's just going to grow and grow with this film.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so question from Caitlin Greenwood, and this is a great one. How much of Jackson's work is predicated on her own experiences of being a deeply weird woman and being treated as a weird or unfeminine woman by people in her life, do you think? And then there's another question, so I'll just whoever wants to tackle this. This is a big one. This is maybe more Hannah and Tara. How important is artistic license for a filmmaker? Who wants to catch either one of those?
I mean, I'm happy to talk about artistic license. Yeah, I mean, it's hugely important. You know, I mean, film is so often, because it has always had this issue from the very beginning of its time. You know, it is a commercial entity. It is a commerce. It is an industry. It always has been. It has been from the days of charlatans trying to make money at fairgrounds. But it is also an artistic medium, and so you know obviously we all watch films for different reasons, and I'm totally fine with that. I get that we don't all go into the cinema wanting the same thing from the big screen, and that's what I mean about expectation. I mean, I would say Josephine Decker doesn't owe you anything. You know, she doesn't owe you the film about Shirley that you want. She doesn't owe you an enjoyable experience in the cinema. It's up to her what she creates, and then it's up to you how you receive it. But I'm a big advocate personally for reception studies as well. I think that, you know, films don't exist in a cultural vacuum. Art doesn't exist in a cultural vacuum. It exists because it has an audience, because it communicates with other people. So I do believe in the impact and the affect that the film has. So, you know, it's a complicated equation. I think absolutely she should have artistic license. I think that, you know, if you want to play loose and fast with history, that's up to you. But as an audience, you also don't have to like it. We always have the option. We have so much power as viewers. We can get up and walk out of anything. You know, we can dislike whatever we want to dislike. There's nothing that says that we have to get on board with and agree with it. So, you know, for me, it's a question of a negotiation. We all make contracts. People who make films make decisions about what art it is they're going to put out into the world. And we, as exhibitors, particularly people who, you know, operate and program in cinemas, we make decisions about what we're going to offer and show our audience. We don't endorse everything we show. Doesn't mean I think the film's great just because we program it. It's something that we think people should see and we think is interesting. And it should be the same with, you know, museums and art galleries. Art should be for people to access. We put these things there, people make them, we put them there, you watch them, you make your decisions about how you feel about it. And that's where for me, that's where it starts to become really interesting, is now we can have a conversation about it. And we don't all have to have the same opinions, readings, likes, dislikes, you know, but that's the kind of creative process. There's creativity at every step of the way in the creation of something, believe it or not, in the distribution and exhibition of it, there is some creativity in the reception and the discussions that take place afterwards. And that's my sort of view on all cinema, to be honest. So I mean, I would say that not just of Shirley and Decker, but of all cinema. Take everything with a pinch of your own salt.
Yeah, a woman to that, Tara. That's exactly how we approach the films that we lift up to. It's essential. Joan, can you maybe tackle I like this question of how much of Jackson's work is predicated on her own experiences of being a deeply, in quotes, weird woman and being treated as weird or unfeminine by people in her own life?
Yeah, that's a really juicy question. Thank you so much for that, Caitlin. I've been thinking a lot lately about the recurrence of witchcraft in Jackson's work and how tarot appears in the film, because Jackson had great fun with her personal reputation playing with the idea of being a witch, and she hated writing biographies for herself to preface her work, and one was actually written for her by Stanley, by Hyman, calling her a witch and celebrating her witchy powers. And she always sort of toyed with the idea of, is this something I actually believe in, or is it something I'm just sort of playing with? She was very mischievous in her creation of a persona. And witchcraft appears in different ways in a lot of her works. In We Have Always Lived in the Castle, there's a lot of rituals, and if I nail this book to a tree, then this will happen. And I wonder the extent to which the archetype of the witch is the kind of the ultimate of the female weirdness, right? The idea that there's something about femininity where you take that romanticized power of being a woman and make it weird and threatening and dangerous, and on the fringe and unacceptable and distasteful. And yeah, I think Jackson's having really good fun with the idea of there being something perhaps latently dangerous in femininity. And I think there's a long heritage and tradition of that in Gothic fiction, of kind of the threat of womanhood being something almost unnatural, so natural it's unnatural. And I think you can see that in the messiness of Elisabeth Moss's Shirley, and in the fact that, you know, this character could very easily have been a grotesque caricature of the tortured artist, but instead Moss gives it something that's very, very sexy, that's very messy, that's very weird, but also very consciously feminine, nurturing with her interactions with Rose's baby, and a kind of a very multivalent, messy, weird woman that comes across nicely in the film and is a bigger part of Jackson's work, definitely.
Hayley, anything to add? You were nodding quite a bit throughout that.
Yeah, I was just thinking about when we're thinking about kind of the monstrous feminine, and Barbara Creed's work is quite influential there. We're talking about kind of the female body as abject, the messiness, the physical messiness of Shirley I find interesting in that she's almost kind of celebrating that reputation of the female body being viewed as abject. One of my favorite parts of the film was actually the moment where Rose, during her pregnancy, is in bed and Fred finds the kind of witchy fertility offering under the bed, and that is a very threatening thing to Fred, whereas it's something that I think Shirley's maybe having fun with. I don't know enough about Shirley Jackson myself to know whether it's something that she believed would benefit the baby, or if it was just something she was playing around with because of her reputation that Joan was talking about. But I did really enjoy that as kind of an instance where we saw how the kind of the traditional 50s masculine man would react to that idea of the witchy woman, the monstrous feminine.
Wonderful, thank you. And Hannah, anything else? Let's go back to the filmmaking and Josephine Decker particularly. Anything else you wanted to kind of pick up on, or push up people what other movies to watch, and a bit of a kind of Decker primer?
Yeah, I think definitely if you have enjoyed Shirley, it's 100% worth watching Josephine's other films. As Tara said, she started out with Butter on the Latch, and then Thou Wast Mild and Lovely, and then Madeline's Madeline. So there's not a lot. It's something you could knock out in a weekend easy. And I think she is I would say that Shirley's her most accessible work, her most kind of quote unquote mainstream work, but it's a real kind of gateway. If you like this kind of experimental interrogation of relationships between women, then I think you'll definitely enjoy looking at her past work. I'd also say, like, she's one of the most kind of fascinating directors to hear from. I mean, I love, whenever I see interviews with her, I always want to read them or watch them. I think she has so many like fascinating ideas about performance and about just making art in general, because she isn't just a director. You know, she's a dancer, she's a traditional artist, she kind of is a choreographer, she has so many strings to her bow, and I think she's very good at kind of weaving this all together. If you go back to Madeline's Madeline, the kind of production history there is fascinating. She saw Helena Howard performing in a high school like showcase, performing a piece of theatre, and tracked her down and convinced her to star in this film. Helena was about 16 at the time, and together they workshopped this entire film, which is kind of not the way I think a lot of directors would do it. I think usually the process is a lot more rigid with filmmaking, but she is someone who I think really goes out on a limb and really kind of trusts her instincts with filmmaking. One of the other things I'll say is that I think that Michael Stuhlbarg in this film is really something that he does so well, which I think, again, this is a character, Stanley is a character who could have very easily become the kind of villain of the piece and become this horrible man keeping this woman locked in her house writing a story. But Stuhlbarg has this wonderful ability to be both kind of unnerving but charming at the same time. You can definitely understand why Shirley loves him and why she is still married to him, and that's not a kind of easy thing to do as an actor, but I think there's just something about him, some sort of strange charisma, and we've seen him before in things like the Coen brothers' A Serious Man and Boardwalk Empire, but he's someone that really has kind of always been on people's radar, but this to me is just really like one of his kind of best roles. I think he is a master of kind of the complicated character role, and his chemistry with Elisabeth Moss in the film. I think they're such two actors at the top of their game, and the way they play off each other and the way they kind of exchange throughout the film is they're just so much fun to watch. I think for all the kind of like lusciousness of the film, it is also just a lot of fun. There's some, kind of really wonderful exchanges. There's really like delicious barbs that you kind of want to save in your head for next time you're in an argument with someone. And, there's just such good kind of rapport between all the characters. I think it's got some of my favorite line readings of the entire year. So yeah, that's my take on it all.
Wonderful, thank you, Hannah. And Joan, you're the resident Shirley Jackson fan girl. So what else would you lift up and recommend the audience to search out next? The Lottery is a big one. I haven't read that, and I'm very keen to. So what else?
Well, The Lottery is available online on the New Yorker. If anyone wants to give it a Google, that's a nice accessible way to get into Jackson and as a proper gut punch of an ending. There's also We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which is probably my favourite novel of hers. Nice and short. And I think there's definitely references to this novel in the film Shirley. There's lots of stuff in there about kind of the moon, and that's also where you get the poison mushrooms from Shirley from as well. So if it's tickled your fancy, I think that'd be the next place to go.
Wonderful. And Tara and Hayley, anything to add before we wrap up?
Not massively from me. Obviously, great if you've had the chance to see Shirley already. I'd say go support a cinema and see it, but you won't be able to do that after today. So, yeah, it's a shame to cut its theatrical run short because it was actually doing really well. But it's great that it's, it did have at least a little bit of time in cinemas before it's going to disappear from our screens.
And I would just say, if you're wanting to experience some other Shirley Jackson novels, if you like audiobooks, there are some fantastic audio narrations of The Haunting of Hill House and We've Always Lived in the Castle. I think it's Bernadette Dunn who is the narrator of those audiobooks. That's how I read them both, and I really recommend them.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for your fabulous input and really expansive ideas. It's really wonderful. And hopefully if people are watching this and haven't seen the film, there's quite a few spoilers in there, but actually the film's so unconventional and surprising. Just don't worry about it, delve in anyway. And it's really worth a second watch. I felt like I discovered a lot the second time. So see it on Curzon Home Cinema. I was